The thermometer inside Alistair MacDougal's cabin registered 53 degrees Fahrenheit on the morning of January 11th, 1893. Outside, the Alaska Territory wind howled across the frozen landscape with temperatures that had bottomed out at 21 degrees below zero overnight. The cabin, small and unremarkable from most angles, maintained this remarkable interior warmth, despite having no fire burning for the past 6 hours. 300 yards away, in a cabin that looked nearly identical from the outside, Joseph Henshaw fed his 5th load of wood into his cast-iron stove since midnight. His interior temperature, despite the continuously burning fire that had consumed nearly 40 pounds of fuel through the night, struggled to maintain 21 degrees above zero. Frost coated the inside of his window, ice rimmed his water bucket. His breath formed clouds as he tried to prepare breakfast, wearing every piece of clothing he owned. The 32-degree temperature difference between the two cabins wasn't about stove size or fuel quality. Both men had similar heating equipment. Both had stockpiled adequate firewood. Both had built their log cabins using the same basic construction techniques that every prospector in Alaska Territory understood and followed. The difference was the roof. Specifically, Alistair's moss roof, the bizarre covering that looked like he'd transplanted an entire section of tundra onto his cabin, the absurdly thick layer of living moss and organic material that everyone said would rot, would leak, would collapse under snow weight, and would provide no meaningful insulation compared to a proper roof. The roof that was now proving to be the most effective insulation system anyone in Alaska Territory had ever seen. 32 degrees warmer, measurable, undeniable, revolutionary, and it worked because one Scottish naturalist understood what everyone else had overlooked, that moss wasn't just a plant to be cleared away. It was nature's most perfect insulation material, refined by millions of years of evolution to trap air, retain moisture when needed, and create thermal barriers that modern materials still can't match. This is the story of how one man's scientific understanding of bryophyte ecology, mocked by every experienced miner and prospector who saw it, became the key to surviving Alaska's brutal winters with minimal fuel consumption. It's about understanding natural insulation, thermal conductivity, and the difference between building what everyone builds and building what actually works in extreme cold. And it's about having the courage to roof your cabin with living moss when everyone insists that's the stupidest idea they've ever heard. Alistair MacDougal was 39 years old when he arrived in Alaska Territory in the spring of 1892, drawn by gold prospects but trained as a botanist. He'd spent 15 years studying plant life throughout Scotland, Norway, and Iceland. He'd specialized in bryology, the study of mosses and liverworts, those humble plants that most people dismissed as inconsequential weeds, but which Alistair knew were among the most remarkable organisms on Earth. Mosses, Alistair understood in ways few others did, were masters of environmental adaptation. They could survive freezing, desiccation, and conditions that killed most other plants. More relevantly to Alaska survival, they were exceptional insulators. Their structure, billions of tiny leaves creating labyrinthine air pockets, trapped still air more effectively than almost any other natural material. Their ability to absorb and hold water gave them thermal mass that moderated temperature swings. Their density could be controlled, creating custom insulation thicknesses. When Alistair surveyed Alaska Territory and saw how prospectors built their cabins, he was struck by the inefficiency of their roofing systems. Most used split logs covered with sod, a technique that provided some insulation but was far from optimal. The thin sod layer, perhaps 3 to 6 inches thick, didn't provide enough mass or air-trapping capability to truly buffer the extreme cold. Heat leaked through these roofs constantly, forcing prospectors to burn enormous amounts of wood just to maintain barely livable conditions. They are losing most of their heat through their roofs, Alistair told his partner, a geologist named Robert Chen who'd traveled to Alaska with him. They don't understand that heat rises, that the greatest thermal loss occurs at the ceiling. They treat the roof as merely weather protection, not as the critical insulation point it should be. Robert, who'd worked with Alistair long enough to trust his botanical expertise, nodded. Can moss provide better insulation? Moss can provide exceptional insulation. Properly applied, a thick moss layer could reduce heat loss by 80% compared to conventional roofing, but they'll think I'm mad when they see what I'm planning. They already think we're odd for bringing scientific instruments to a gold field. A moss roof will just confirm their opinion. The standard cabin in Alaska Territory in 1892 was a log structure, typically 12 by 16 feet, with walls about 7 feet high. The roof was usually made from split logs laid close together, covered with birch bark or tar paper for water resistance, then topped with sod cut from the tundra. The sod layer was thin, primarily intended to hold the waterproofing in place and provide minimal insulation. Total roof thickness, including all layers, might be 8 to 12 inches. Alistair's plan was radically different. He was going to build a roof with a moss layer nearly 3 feet thick. 3 feet of carefully selected, properly prepared, living moss that would create an insulation barrier so effective that his cabin would maintain comfortable temperatures with minimal heating. When he explained his plan to the neighboring prospectors, their reactions were swift and universally negative. 3 feet of moss on your roof? Joseph Henshaw asked incredulously. That's not a roof. That's a bog sitting on top of your cabin. It'll leak like a sieve. It'll rot your timbers. It'll collapse under the first heavy snow, and it won't insulate any better than regular sod. Moss has exceptional insulation properties, Alistair explained. The structure traps air very effectively. 3 feet of properly prepared moss will provide insulation equivalent to perhaps 12 to 18 inches of the best modern materials. Moss is just moss. It's plants. Plants don't insulate. They grow in wet areas. You're putting a swamp on your roof. It's the worst building material you could choose. Another prospector, a veteran named Marcus Stone who'd been in Alaska for 5 years, was more blunt. I've seen a lot of greenhorn mistakes. Building with moss is top of the list. You'll spend all summer gathering moss while you should be mining. You'll build a roof that'll fail within a month. Come winter, you'll be rebuilding with proper materials or you'll freeze. Mark my words. Moss has been used for insulation in Nordic countries for centuries, Alistair countered. It's proven technology. This isn't Norway. This is Alaska. Different climate, different conditions. What works somewhere else won't work here. Build a proper roof like everyone else or learn the hard way. But Alistair had no intention of building like everyone else. He'd studied moss ecology for 15 years. He knew what mosses could do, what properties they possessed, and how to work with them. His roof would be unconventional, certainly, but it would also be the most thermally efficient roof in Alaska Territory. Construction began in late May, while other prospectors were building their cabins quickly to allow maximum time for mining. Alistair spent weeks on preparation. First, he built his cabin walls using standard log construction. Nothing unusual here, just solid workmanship with properly chinked logs and a good foundation. Then came the roof structure. Instead of the minimal support that most prospectors used, Alistair built a heavy framework capable of supporting enormous weight. Thick rafters on 18-inch centers with heavy cross-bracing. The frame alone was stronger than most complete cabin roofs. The prospectors watching shook their heads at the waste of timber and labor. Building a roof that could hold 5 men standing on it, Stone commented. Complete overkill, waste of time and wood. But Alistair knew the weight his roof would eventually bear. 3 feet of moss, especially when wet, would weigh several tons. The frame needed to be substantially overbuilt by conventional standards to support what he had planned. Once the frame was complete, he began the waterproofing layer. He used split cedar, naturally water-resistant, laid tightly together, and sealed with pitch harvested from spruce trees. This, created a completely waterproof barrier. Over this, he built a drainage layer using small sticks laid perpendicular to the rafters, creating air channels that would allow any moisture that did penetrate to drain away. Then came the moss harvesting. This is where Alistair's botanical knowledge became critical. Not all moss species were suitable for roofing. He needed species that would form dense mats, that could survive the harsh environment, and that had excellent air-trapping properties. He selected primarily sphagnum moss, particularly species from the genera Sphagnum gergensoni and Sphagnum fuscum. These species formed dense, springy mats and had exceptional water-holding capacity that would provide thermal mass. He also harvested feather moss and haircap moss for structural diversity. Each species contributed different properties to the final roof system. The harvesting process took 3 weeks. Alistair walked miles across the tundra, carefully harvesting moss in large sheets, keeping the underlying structure intact. He avoided over-harvesting any single area, taking only mature moss and leaving younger growth to regenerate. This wasn't just environmental consciousness. He needed healthy, viable moss that would continue growing on his roof, creating a living insulation system that would improve over time. The prospectors watching this process were bewildered and increasingly convinced that Alistair had lost his mind. "He's harvesting moss like it's gold," Henshaw said to Stone, "walking miles to collect plants that grow everywhere, spending weeks on material he could gather in days if he just grabbed whatever was convenient. This is beyond foolish. It's obsessive." "Wait until he tries to put it all on his roof," Stone replied. "It'll slide off within a week. Moss doesn't stick to roofs. It needs wet ground. He's trying to grow a garden on his cabin." But Alistair knew exactly what he was doing. The careful species selection, the attention to mat structure, the preservation of the root systems, all these details mattered for creating a roof that would function properly. Random moss thrown on a roof would fail. Carefully selected and properly installed moss would create an insulation system that would last decades. The installation began in mid-July. Alistair started with a base layer of dried grass and small twigs, creating a rough substrate about 6 inches thick. This provided drainage and created a matrix for the moss to integrate with. Over this, he began laying the moss sheets. He worked in layers, placing moss sheets like shingles, overlapping them to prevent gaps. Each layer was about 6 inches thick when compressed. He built up the moss systematically, layer by layer, checking constantly to ensure even thickness and good integration between layers. The moss, even when being installed, began to knit together, individual plants extending and intertwining. The process was painstaking and slow. Alistair installed perhaps 100 square feet of roof per day, working carefully to ensure quality. The roof structure gradually disappeared under an increasingly thick layer of moss. By early August, the moss layer was approaching 2 feet thick. By late August, it exceeded 30 inches. The cabin looked bizarre, as if a section of tundra had been lifted and placed on top of the log structure. The visual impact was striking and, to the prospector's eyes, ridiculous. The massive green mound on Alistair's roof looked nothing like a proper cabin roof. It looked like a natural hill with a cabin door emerging from the side. The thickness was absurd. The living plants seemed entirely out of place as building material. Everything about it suggested impracticality and pending failure. "It's a green haystack on top of a cabin," Stone's wife commented. "Most outlandish thing I've ever seen someone call a roof. It'll rot, leak, and collapse. Probably all 3 at once." Henshaw agreed. 3 feet of plants on his roof. "I've never seen a worse building decision. Come the first rain, he'll have a waterfall inside his cabin. Come the first snow, the weight will crush his rafters. Come winter, he'll be the coldest man in Alaska because his roof will be frozen solid, conducting cold straight into his cabin." The mockery reached its peak in September when the first significant rain hit. The moss absorbed the water like an enormous sponge. The roof darkened as it saturated. The weight increased dramatically. The prospectors watched, expecting to see the rafters sag or hear the structure creak under the load. But Alistair's overbuilt frame held easily. The moss absorbed gallons of water without any structural distress, and then something remarkable happened. Over the next 3 days, as the weather cleared, the moss released most of the absorbed water through evaporation and drainage. The roof lightened, but even when relatively dry, the moss retained its structure and its insulation properties. The moss didn't slide off, Henshaw admitted to Stone. I expected it to slough off like wet dirt, but it's holding together. Holding together doesn't mean it works as a roof. Wait until winter. We'll see how his moss performs when it really matters. October brought the first hard freezes. Temperatures dropped below zero. Ice formed. Snow fell. The prospectors watched to see if Alistair's moss roof would freeze solid and become a block of ice sitting on his cabin, conducting cold directly into his living space as they predicted. Instead, something different happened. The moss, even when frozen on its outer surface, retained air pockets throughout its structure. The freezing actually enhanced its insulation properties by creating a stable barrier. Snow that fell on the roof was held by the moss surface, creating an additional insulation layer. The entire system worked together, each element contributing to thermal protection. Alistair conducted his first heating test in late October, when outside, temperatures dropped to 8 degrees above zero. He lit a small fire in his modest stove, burned it for about 2 hours, then extinguished it. He wanted to see how long the cabin would retain heat without any active fire. The result exceeded even his optimistic predictions. The cabin temperature, when he extinguished the fire, was 68 degrees. Over the next 6 hours, it dropped only to 58 degrees. A 10-degree loss over 6 hours, with outside temperature 30 degrees colder. The heat retention was extraordinary. He invited Henshaw over to observe. Henshaw entered the cabin expecting to find Alistair burning wood to stay warm. Instead, he found a warm cabin with no fire burning. "Where's your fire?" Henshaw asked. "I extinguished it 5 hours ago. The cabin holds heat remarkably well." Henshaw looked up at the ceiling, which showed no sign of frost or cold spots. 5 hours with no fire, and it's still warm. The moss roof prevents heat loss. Very little warmth escapes through the ceiling. The cabin loses heat only through the walls and floor, which are reasonably well insulated, but the roof, with 3 feet of moss, is nearly impermeable to heat transfer. Henshaw put his hand against the ceiling. It was cool, but not cold. In his own cabin, the ceiling was always cold to the touch, especially near the rafters. Heat escaped constantly through his thin roof. Alistair's moss roof, by contrast, held heat like no roof Henshaw had ever experienced. "I didn't think moss could insulate like this," Henshaw said. "Moss is one of nature's best insulators. The structure is perfect for trapping air. Billions of tiny leaves create countless small air pockets. Air is an excellent insulator when trapped and kept still. The moss does that better than almost any other material." Henshaw left Alistair's cabin thoughtful. He told Stone what he'd observed. The mockery began to shift toward cautious interest. If Alistair's moss roof really could hold heat that effectively, it might not be as foolish as it looked. But the real test came in December and January, when Alaska Territory experienced one of its coldest winters on record. Temperatures dropped to 20 and 30 below zero and stayed there for weeks. The wind was constant and brutal, driving wind chills to lethal levels. Survival became the only priority. Mining stopped. Everything stopped except the desperate effort to stay alive. The prospectors' conventional cabins became barely survivable spaces. Even with fires burning continuously, consuming enormous amounts of wood, interior temperatures rarely exceeded 30 degrees. The thin roof insulation allowed heat to escape as fast as it was generated. The cold found every weakness, every gap, every pathway through inadequate insulation, and exploited it ruthlessly. Wood consumption was staggering. Henshaw estimated he was burning 80 to 100 pounds of wood per day, cutting and hauling constantly just to keep pace with demand. The work was exhausting and dangerous in the extreme cold, but without continuous burning, his cabin would drop to lethal temperatures within hours. Alistair's routine was completely different. He burned a fire twice per day, morning and evening, for about 2 hours each time. Total wood consumption, roughly 20 to 25 pounds per day. Between fires, his cabin maintained comfortable temperatures purely through heat retention. The moss roof, 3 feet of frozen but air-filled material, prevented heat from escaping upward. The result was a cabin that stayed warm with minimal heating. On the coldest night, when outside temperatures hit 28 degrees below zero, Alistair conducted careful measurements. He burned his evening fire, heating the cabin to 65 degrees. He extinguished the fire at 8 o'clock in the evening. Through the night, he measured temperature every 2 hours. At 10 o'clock, 2 hours after extinguishing the fire, the interior temperature was 61 degrees. At midnight, it was 58 degrees. At 2 in the morning, 55 degrees. At 4 o'clock, 53 degrees. At 6 in the morning, when he woke, 51 degrees. The cabin had lost only 14 degrees over 10 hours, with outside temperature over 70 degrees colder. That same night, Henshaw's cabin, with a fire burning continuously through all 10 hours, never exceeded 21 degrees. The comparison was devastating. Alistair's cabin with no fire was 30 degrees warmer than Henshaw's cabin with continuous fire. The moss roof had created a thermal envelope so effective that minimal heating was sufficient for genuine comfort. The mathematics of the efficiency difference were stark. Alistair burned perhaps 25 pounds of wood per day. Henshaw burned 90 pounds per day. Alistair used less than 1/3 the fuel for vastly superior results. Over a 6-month winter, Alistair would consume roughly 3 cords of wood. Henshaw would consume 12 to 15 cords. The labor difference, the cost difference, the comfort difference, all overwhelmingly favored the moss roof. If you're learning about these natural insulation techniques that could dramatically reduce your heating costs while keeping you warmer, make sure to hit that subscribe button. We're uncovering forgotten building wisdom that's more relevant than ever. Subscribe so you never miss these practical stories. The 32-degree temperature difference on the coldest night became the defining metric of Alistair's moss roof performance. 32 degrees warmer than conventional roofs, measured under the most extreme conditions Alaska could deliver. The number was objective, reproducible, and undeniable. The moss roof worked, and worked dramatically better than anything else. Word spread through the scattered mining camps of Alaska Territory. The Scottish botanist had built a cabin with a 3-foot moss roof that stayed 30 degrees warmer than conventional cabins while using a quarter of the fuel. Some dismissed the reports as exaggeration. Others traveled to verify for themselves. Those who visited Alistair's cabin during the coldest weeks experienced the same transformation Henshaw had felt. The warmth was real. The fuel consumption was observably minimal. The comfort was undeniable. Every visitor left convinced that Alistair had discovered something revolutionary. By February, 5 prospectors had committed to building moss roofs the following summer. Alistair agreed to teach them, explaining the principles of species selection, proper installation, and structural requirements. He emphasized that details mattered. Random moss thrown on a roof wouldn't work. Carefully selected species, properly installed with adequate thickness and proper drainage, would create insulation that no conventional material could match. The moss must be installed correctly, Alistair explained to a group of prospectors who came to learn. You need adequate thickness, at least 24 to 36 inches. You need proper species selection. Sphagnum and feather mosses work best. You need good drainage beneath the moss to prevent rot. And you need a frame strong enough to support the weight. How do we know if we've selected the right moss? One prospector asked. Sphagnum is easily identified by its pale color and spongy texture. It grows in wet areas, harvested in mats, keeping the structure intact. Feather moss is darker, grows on drier ground, and has a more delicate structure. Both are excellent insulators. Mix them together for best results. What about keeping the moss alive? Does it need to stay living? The moss can be living or dead. Both work. Living moss will continue growing, filling any gaps and actually improving over time. Dead moss retains its structure and insulation properties indefinitely if kept dry beneath. Either approach works, though I prefer living moss for its self-maintaining properties. The construction process was labor-intensive, as Alistair warned. Each builder spent 3 to 4 weeks harvesting moss, then another 3 to 4 weeks installing it properly. The time investment was significant, but those who completed moss roofs reported immediate and dramatic benefits. Their cabins were warmer, their fuel consumption dropped by 60 to 75%, and their quality of life improved substantially. One particularly successful implementation came from a Norwegian prospector named Bjorn Halvorsen, who combined Alistair's moss roof with increased wall insulation. Bjorn built his walls thicker than standard, then covered them with additional moss. His entire cabin was wrapped in moss, creating a complete thermal envelope. His interior temperatures in winter exceeded 60 degrees with only 1 fire per day. His fuel consumption was even lower than Alistair's. Another innovation came from a prospector named Samuel Wright, who built his moss roof with built-in ventilation channels. These channels, running from eave to peak, allowed moisture to escape in summer while closing off naturally in winter. The system prevented any potential rot while maintaining the insulation benefits. Wright's design proved even more durable than Alistair's original, lasting without maintenance for over 15 years. These variations demonstrated that moss roofing was a principle, not just a single design. The core insight that properly installed moss provided exceptional insulation could be adapted to different climates, different cabin designs, and different builder preferences. The knowledge evolved through community practice, each builder contributing insights that improved the technique. By the winter of 1893 to 1894, roughly 1/3 of the cabins within 50 miles of Alistair's camp used moss roofs of varying designs. The results were universally positive. Fuel consumption dropped dramatically. Interior temperatures were more stable and comfortable. Time spent on heating-related labor decreased significantly. The technique had proven itself beyond any doubt. The spread of moss roofing wasn't limited to Alaska. Letters sent to families in the lower states described the moss roof technique. Scientific journals, hearing of Alistair's work, published articles about the thermal properties of bryophytes and their potential as insulation materials. Building professionals, intrigued by the efficiency reports, began experimenting with moss in their own constructions. The technical explanation for the moss roof's exceptional performance involved several factors working synergistically. The primary factor was air trapping. Moss structure, with billions of tiny leaves and stems, created an incredibly complex three-dimensional matrix. This matrix trapped air in countless tiny pockets. Since air is one of the best natural insulators when kept still, and moss kept air very still, the insulation value was extremely high. The thickness mattered enormously. 3 feet of moss provided an R value, in modern terms, of approximately 50 to 60. A conventional roof with 6 inches of sod might provide an R value of 8 to 12. The difference wasn't incremental. It was transformative. Heat simply couldn't conduct through 3 feet of air-filled moss in any time frame relevant to human comfort. The moisture management properties of moss also contributed. Sphagnum moss could absorb up to 20 times its dry weight in water. This water provided thermal mass that moderated temperature swings. When frozen, the ice crystals created additional structure that enhanced insulation. The moss managed moisture better than any synthetic material, absorbing excess humidity from the cabin interior and releasing it when conditions allowed. preventing the dampness that plagued poorly ventilated structures. The living aspect of Alistair's roof provided long-term benefits. The moss continued growing, slowly but steadily. It filled any small gaps that developed. It created an increasingly dense mat that improved insulation over time, rather than degrading like conventional materials. It required no maintenance beyond occasional watering during dry periods, which rain provided naturally. The roof literally maintained itself. The structural integrity was also remarkable. Unlike loose insulation that could settle or shift, the moss formed an interlocking mat that held its position. Unlike synthetic materials that could degrade from UV exposure or temperature cycling, moss was designed by evolution to withstand exactly those stresses. The roof that prospectors predicted would fail within months proved to be one of the most durable roofing systems possible. The environmental sustainability was significant, though rarely discussed in those terms. Moss was renewable, requiring no industrial processing. Harvesting didn't damage the landscape if done carefully, as moss regenerated quickly. The reduced wood consumption meant less forest pressure. An entire building system that worked with nature rather than requiring manufactured inputs represented sustainability that modern green building still aspires to achieve. The story of Alistair's moss roof illustrates how specialized knowledge from unexpected domains can solve practical problems. Alistair's 15 years studying bryology, which most people considered an esoteric academic pursuit, gave him insights that saved lives and improved frontier living conditions. The knowledge transfer from botanical science to practical building created innovation that conventional building wisdom never achieved. The mockery Alistair faced was based on superficial observation and assumption. The prospectors saw plants on a roof and thought impractical. They saw thickness and thought wasteful. They saw unfamiliarity and thought inferior. Every visible aspect contradicted their experience-based expectations. They couldn't imagine that simple moss could outperform conventional materials because they didn't understand the physics of insulation or the biology of bryophytes. Alistair's vindication was absolute and measured: 32 degrees warmer, 1/4 the fuel consumption, superior comfort in every metric. These weren't subjective assessments, they were objective measurements that anyone could verify. The moss roof didn't just work slightly better, it worked transformatively better. The willingness of prospectors like Henshaw to admit error and learn was crucial to the technique's adoption. When confronted with undeniable evidence, they chose intellectual honesty over defending their pride. They learned from Alistair, built their own moss roofs, and became advocates for the technique. This flexibility enabled rapid knowledge spread and community-wide improvement. The collaborative refinement that followed Alistair's initial demonstration showed how open knowledge sharing accelerates innovation. Alistair taught freely. His students experimented and improved. Their innovations fed back into the community knowledge, creating designs better than Alistair's original. Open-source innovation outpaced what any single inventor could achieve. The longevity of moss roofing is remarkable. The technique never became mainstream, primarily because it required more initial labor than conventional roofing, and because most people couldn't imagine using plants as building material. But in regions where it was adopted, moss roofs lasted for decades, outliving conventional roofs multiple times over. Some moss roofs built in the 1890s were still functional in the 1940s, having required almost no maintenance for 50 years. Modern green building has rediscovered living roofs, though most contemporary implementations use shallow soil with various plants rather than thick moss layers. The principles Alistair demonstrated, that living plant material can provide exceptional insulation while managing moisture and creating habitat, remain valid. Contemporary research into bryophyte thermal properties confirms what Alistair knew empirically. Moss is an extraordinary insulator. The 32-degree temperature difference measured on the coldest night became the symbol of what proper insulation could achieve. It quantified the gap between adequate and excellent, between conventional wisdom and scientific understanding, between building like everyone else and building based on knowledge of how materials actually perform. The 3-foot thickness that everyone mocked as absurd proved to be the key to performance. Insulation effectiveness isn't linear. It follows logarithmic principles. The first 6 inches of insulation provides significant benefit. The next 6 inches provides less additional benefit, and so on. But at the extreme thickness Alistair used, the cumulative effect was transformative. Heat loss slowed to nearly imperceptible rates. The cabin became nearly thermally independent, requiring minimal heating input to maintain comfort. The living aspect that everyone said would cause problems, the moisture, the growth, the organic nature of the material, these proved to be advantages rather than liabilities. The moss managed moisture better than any synthetic vapor barrier. The growth filled gaps better than any caulking. The organic nature meant the roof worked with natural cycles rather than fighting them. Before we finish, if you're fascinated by these natural building techniques that could save you massive amounts on heating while improving comfort, don't forget to subscribe. Hit that subscribe button so you never miss our content on practical building wisdom and forgotten efficient technologies. The social impact of Alistair's success extended beyond roofing technique. He'd been an outsider, a scientist among miners, someone pursuing academic interests in a practical environment. His success proved that seemingly impractical knowledge could have extremely practical applications. The botanist who studied moss for its own sake ended up solving a survival problem that stumped experienced frontiersmen. The economic benefits for adopters were substantial. Lower fuel costs, whether purchased or gathered through labor. Reduced time spent on heating tasks. Better health from more consistent warmth. Longer-lasting roofs that didn't need frequent replacement. These advantages accumulated into meaningful quality-of-life improvements and economic savings. A miner saving 9 cords of wood per winter saved roughly 200 hours of cutting and processing labor, time that could be spent mining, resting, or simply living. The technique continued evolving after Alistair's introduction. By the early 1900s, some builders were creating elaborate moss roof systems with multiple species layers, each chosen for specific properties. Others developed techniques for establishing moss on roofs rather than harvesting wild moss, creating farms where moss could be cultivated for building purposes. Still others experimented with moss combinations with other natural materials like pine needles or dried grasses. Alistair remained in Alaska until 1906, when he returned to Scotland with enough gold to fund his botanical research for the remainder of his life. His original moss roof remained on his cabin, used by subsequent occupants for another 20 years. The moss continued growing, becoming an increasingly thick mat that provided even better insulation as years passed. When the cabin was finally abandoned in the late 1920s, the moss roof was still structurally sound and fully functional. The broader lesson from Alistair's moss roof is that nature often provides solutions better than those we manufacture. Moss, refined by millions of years of evolution to insulate itself and trap moisture, performed better than any insulation available in the 1890s. It performed better than many insulations available today. The natural material, working with natural properties, achieved results that synthetic materials struggle to match. Everyone mocked Alistair MacDougal's moss roof. They said 3 feet of plants was absurd. They said moss would rot and leak. They said the weight would collapse his rafters. They said he was wasting his summer gathering worthless material. They said his cabin would be the coldest in Alaska because moss conducted cold. They were confident, experienced with Alaska building, and completely wrong about everything. Then his cabin stayed 32 degrees Fahrenheit warmer than theirs. Then his fuel consumption dropped to 1/4 of theirs. Then his cabin maintained comfort with minimal heating while theirs required continuous burning. Then every measurable metric proved his moss roof was vastly superior to their conventional roofs. The mockery turned to amazement. The amazement turned to study. The study turned to imitation. The imitation turned to innovation. That's how genuine advancement happens. Not through tradition or fashion, but through results so compelling that resistance becomes impossible. Alistair built different. He was mocked for it. He was proven right by evidence that couldn't be dismissed. His absurd-looking moss mound outperformed conventional roofs so dramatically that even his harshest critics had to acknowledge reality. 32 degrees warmer, 1/4 the fuel, superior in every way. That's the power of understanding natural materials. That's the reward for scientific knowledge applied to practical problems. That's what happens when someone builds based on understanding material properties rather than following what everyone else does. The moss roof, mocked by everyone who saw it under construction, proved to be the most effective insulation system on the Alaska frontier. 32 degrees warmer proved it. The dramatic fuel savings proved it. The decades of durability proved it. Alistair MacDougal was right. His mockers were wrong. And the difference between them was measured in warmth, in saved labor, in comfort, and in the quiet satisfaction of knowing that sometimes the solution everyone mocks is the solution that actually works. The moss roof that looked ridiculous was actually brilliant. The 3-foot thickness that seemed wasteful was actually optimal. The living plants that seemed impractical were actually perfect. The design that everyone dismissed was actually revolutionary. That's the lesson. That's the story. That's why we're still talking about Alistair MacDougal's moss roof more than a century later, because it proved that nature, when understood properly, provides solutions better than we can manufacture. Because 32 degrees warmer isn't just a number, it's proof that observation, understanding, and the courage to build differently can transform survival from desperate to comfortable. And because sometimes the botanist everyone thinks is impractical is the only person who truly understands what's possible.